You all hear me? Hi, Miss Aimee. How are you?
Hello, I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Good, good, good.
That's good.
So,
Just
first of all,
getting
it's good
myself.
afternoon. Yeah, it's afternoon, right? In Australia.
It's just gone midday here.
Yeah. So, yeah, morning, 10 a.m. in the morning. So you want to start now, or how?
Do you want to wait maybe a couple more minutes?
Yes,
Just for
can.
anybody who's
Yeah,
late, perhaps?
yeah. Because today is a public holiday in Malaysia.
Oh no, we could have
Yeah.
changed days. Oh
So
no.
I'm so glad to see our colleagues and students inside. We are quite impressed. They are willing to
Oh,
spend their holiday for these sessions.
absolutely, absolutely. Oh, okay. So I'll just get my slideshow sorted.
Actually, today we have a guest from Australia also. Prof. Stewart is
Oh
here
yeah.
today. Yeah, Prof.
Eh,
Stewart, Caroline is here.
oh yes.
Yeah, they're having a NCORS program.
Oh, anchors.
Mm.
Right.
So I just met them this morning.
Very nice. Okay.
Good morning, Aimee. Jasmine here. Just want to
Hello,
let
Jasmine.
just want to let you know that the material that you share over the chat, right? Basically, we can't access because that one is actually shared through the UOW Australia SharePoint. We need to have the UOW Australia email in order for us to access to that material. So would that be possible? Maybe you just email to either one of us so that we can circulate among all the participants.
Yeah, certainly I can do that now, but it is just a PDF document that's in there. It's
Yes.
not on SharePoint though.
When
It's
we
not actually, have you tried opening it?
Yes, when I click on it, it require your Australia email to log in order to access to that material.
Okay, I'll email it to you now.
Okay, thank you.
Email. Okay. Jasmine, here we go. Okay. So I'm just sending it through to you now. If you could maybe, yeah, give access to the participants.
Yeah. All
I'll
right,
have them
will do.
read through it later and we'll talk about it.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Are we ready to get started then? Yeah.
Yes, please, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Aimee Wall, and I'm from the Research Integrity Development and Ethics team at the University of Wollongong in Australia. And today I'll be speaking to you about ethics in research. At the end of the presentation, I'll invite you to ask any questions that you might have. So I will ask you not to ask questions as we're going through, but to maybe hold them to the end. And if you would like, you could put them in the chat as we go along. And at the end, we'll take a look at any questions that are in there and we can talk about them then. Okay. I'm going to start by making the distinction between research ethics and research integrity. I understand my colleague Raya spoke to you about this last week. The two terms are often used interchangeably and they are interrelated, but there is quite a distinct difference between the two of them. So at its most basic, research integrity relates to the expectations for you as an individual researcher and the university as an institution to conduct your research responsibly and in accordance with the Malaysian and Australian codes for the responsible conduct of research. With research integrity, the focus is on your character as a researcher, and the primary responsibility for it sits with you. Importantly, research integrity applies to every type of research and every researcher. By contrast, research ethics applies to research that involves people and/or research that involves animals. Ethics comes from the perspective of judgments about the ethical acceptability of research, and the primary responsibility for research ethics sits with ethics committees. So today, I'll be talking to you specifically about research ethics with a focus on human research ethics and a little on animal ethics at the end. However, before we can start talking about human research ethics, we really need to be clear on what we mean by human research. So human research is research that's conducted with or about people, their tissue or their data. So this ranges from surveys to focus groups, dietary interventions, all the way through to clinical trials of experimental drugs or experimental medical devices. Importantly, it also includes research that uses existing data sets of information which have been collected from people or about people. So some examples of data sets might include your public health records with hospitals, epidemiology data sets, financial data sets such as from your federal taxation office, and also, very importantly, it includes data that's been collected in previous research studies. Okay, so I'm going to start by asking you, what do you think of when you hear the word ethics? What kind of words come to mind when people start talking about ethics? And maybe if you wouldn't mind just putting some of those words just into the chat now, and we'll have a little talk about the meaning of the word ethics. Yeah. Integrity, this is true. Honesty, yes. Yeah. Some other words that often come to mind, definitely privacy protection, can be morals, values, fairness, accountability, perhaps, respect. All right, so I'm going to play a short video for you about ethical decision making, which, yes, what is morally right and wrong? Yeah, exactly. So this short video touches on many of these things, transparency, yes, all of these kinds of things. And we'll just have a quick watch of the video and then we'll talk about it afterwards. Sorry, are you not able to hear the sound on this video? Oh, you can't hear the sound? Okay. Hang on a minute, then I'll try to solve this issue. Hey, Brian, could you help me for a minute? I'm trying to play video and the sound isn't playing for them, just the picture. So is there something?
I think
Hmm.
go to where's the rest go up the top
Mm-hmm.
and just hover. No, hover at the top. Yeah.
Share sound?
Yeah.
Okay.
See if that works.
We'll try again, guys. Sorry about that. How's that?
How many decisions do you think you make each day? If you ask the internet, the answer will range from 70 to 35,000. If you ask us, it's the wrong question to be asking at all. That's because we're interested in ethics. We're not concerned about the quantity of your decisions. We care about their quality. You might want to think of ethics as a tool that helps us create the difference between a good decision and a bad one. Ethics is the branch of philosophy that asks the practical question, what should we do? This leads to the study of things like values, principles, beliefs, and norms. These are the things that shape our choices. Ethics asks us, how should we live? What choices should we make? And what makes our lives worth living? It tries to help us define the conditions of a good choice and then figure out which of our available options is the best one. Let's say a close friend, Lee, confides in you that they're struggling with depression. They're feeling isolated and alone, but whenever they're invited to go out, they find it impossible to do. Lee insists they don't want anyone else to know. They're trusting this information to you alone. A few days later, another friend comes to you, frustrated about Lee. Lee's flaked on plans at the last minute yet again, and your friend has had enough. They've decided they just won't bother inviting Lee out anymore. So you're torn. If Lee stops being invited to things, the isolation could make them feel even worse. Sharing information about their depression might help Lee be treated with more empathy and compassion. But it would be a breach of trust. And if Lee found out, especially in a vulnerable state, who knows what might happen? What do you do? Keep the secret and allow Lee to be socially isolated? Or break Lee's trust, but do it for their benefit? Answering this question means getting clear on what matters, our values and principles. Our values are the things we hold to be good and therefore care about most deeply. Things like justice, knowledge, family and equality. In this case, we're likely to value both trustworthiness and compassion, which pull us in different directions. So it looks like an appeal to values alone won't let us solve this dilemma. We don't just need to know what's good, we need to know what's right. This is where principles come in. They help us draw a line in the sand. They determine the acceptable ways of getting the things that we value. So what's our guiding principle with regard to Lee? Some people might adopt a principle like be true to your word, meaning you keep Lee's confidence no matter the risks. Others might be inclined towards a principle like act in people's best interests and decide that it's in Lee's best interest that people know about the depression. Of course, there are still ambiguities, which is part of what makes ethical decision-making so complicated. So how do we select which values and principles to adopt? And how do we make choices when we face a conflict of values and principles? Good versus good, right versus right. What helps to orient our judgment is a connection to purpose. What's our guiding North Star? What's our reason for being? Think about Lee again. Now, think about the purpose of friendship. What are friends for? Think about why Lee decided to tell you in confidence. Your purpose as Lee's friend is to share their life with them, the highs and the lows. But it's their life and it's their decision on who they share it with. Lee chose to share this information with you alone. Given this, even if you prefer to act in people's best interests, thinking about purpose and thinking about Lee's purpose might encourage you to take a different path. Every time we make a choice, we change the world. What kind of world do you want to live in? Whether you make 5,000 choices a day or just one, what's important is that you make choices that are good and right. Choices you can justify, ones you can be proud of. That's what makes the choices actively yours.
Okay, so thanks for persevering there. Basically, what that little clip tells us is that ethics is not black and white. People hold different values, and what one person sees as the right thing to do might not align with someone else's view of what is the right thing to do. Ideas of what's good or bad, right or wrong, can vary widely depending on personal beliefs, cultural backgrounds, and life experiences. This leads us to the next important question today. What does the right thing look like in research? When we talk about ethical research, what do we really mean and why does it matter? As we saw in the video, the right thing isn't always clear, and the same certainly goes for research. People don't all have the same views of what is a risk or burden or what is of benefit to the community. Within a community, values will vary considerably, and between communities, it'll vary even more. In thinking about ethical research, it helps to understand what doing the wrong thing looks like. Throughout history, and the 20th century in particular, we've witnessed many examples in which people were subjected to unacceptable treatment in the name of science and in the name of research. And I'm going to go through them briefly with you now to help us understand how it is we've arrived where we have with ethics in research. In World War II, known to many of us, Nazi scientists in Germany conducted medical experiments on prisoners held in concentration camps. The experiments included freezing and heating people to improve knowledge about the conditions faced by German soldiers through European winters. It involved exposing people to infectious diseases and brutal surgeries, often resulting in severe suffering and death. Nazi doctors pursued so-called genetic research, attempting to prove racial superiority through twin studies and eugenics programs without the consent of the people involved. The so-called research results were then used as propaganda for the Nazi agenda. Unfortunately, though, unethical practices continued in the name of research. In fact, one such study was undertaken to try and understand how it was the atrocities that occurred in Nazi Germany were able to happen. So this study is known as the Milgram shock experiment, and it was a psychological study which was conducted at Yale University in the United States of America. Can you not hear me? Sorry, could you not hear what I was just saying? You could hear? Okay, I'll just continue. Oh, great, thank you. So the Milgram shock experiment, it was a psychological study and it occurred at Yale University in 1961 by Stanley Milgram. And the purpose of the experiment was to test obedience to authority in response to the Nuremberg trials, in which many Nazi war criminals defended their actions by claiming they were just following orders. Milgram wanted to understand whether ordinary people could commit harmful acts under authority pressure. So participants in this study were instructed to administer severe electric shocks to a learner whenever the learner answered a question incorrectly. The learner was actually an actor pretending to react to pain from the shocks. And despite hearing distressing screams, many participants continued delivering shocks up to dangerous levels because an authoritative figure, who was actually the researcher, told them to do so. Once participants learned the truth, some were relieved that they had not actually inflicted pain on others, but some of the other participants were deeply disturbed by their own behaviour. Milgram later followed up with participants, some of whom expressed lasting distress over what they had done. Another one of the more well-known medical studies is the Tuskegee syphilis study. This study was run by the United States Public Health Service in Alabama for 40 years, from 1932 to 1972. The experiment recruited 600 black men, only black men, who lived on very low incomes. 399 of the men who were recruited for the study had syphilis. To entice these men to participate in the study, they were offered free meals and free health care. When the research began, syphilis was incurable, and the intention of the study was to observe its symptoms over time. Some of the men were put on toxic treatments of arsenic and mercury, while others were given no treatment at all. Without treatment, syphilis can cause permanent organ damage. It can cause paralysis, blindness, severe mental illness, and even death. However, 15 years after the study began, penicillin broke through as widely available and effective treatment for syphilis. But this was never offered to the men in the experiment, who were left in the study without legitimate treatment for a further 25 years, purely so the long-term effects of syphilis could be assessed. At no stage were the men with syphilis told about the risks of participation. They were not told that they were putting their lives at risk by participating in the study. They were never told that they were not receiving treatment, or told that they were spreading syphilis to their sexual partners. The truth of the Tuskegee study was revealed 40 years after it started, and it was only found out because a whistleblower leaked documents to the media. The entirely black participant group, who were recruited for their social vulnerability and need for food and health care, were treated as subhuman, left to suffer and die, while accessible treatments were ignored. Here in Australia, the nuclear testing by the British at Maralinga in the South Australian desert in the late 50s and 60s occurred with the agreement of the Australian government. During the tests, Australian servicemen were ordered to repeatedly fly through the mushroom clouds without protection and to march and crawl into ground zero immediately after nuclear bomb detonation without protective clothing, to study the effects of radiation on humans. Up to 30% of involved personnel died, mostly in their 50s, from cancers, and others suffered genetic damage. Aboriginal people were denied access to their traditional lands and experienced severe health problems afterwards. These tests were conducted with a complete disregard for the humans involved, and it took decades of activism for the Australian government to acknowledge the harm that was caused. Also, during World War II, Japan conducted lethal biological warfare experiments on prisoners in occupied China under a covert program known as Unit 731. Prisoners, including civilians, were deliberately infected with deadly pathogens like anthrax and plague without their consent, and often under the guise of medical treatment. So, what these experiments show us is that not only were they inhumane, they caused immense suffering and violated every ethical principle that we now associate with research. They highlight that research without ethics can lead to atrocities, and there is a need for robust ethical guidelines to protect the welfare and rights of research participants and the scientific community at large. A number of international human rights instruments emerged since this time. These include the Declaration of Helsinki, the UN, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, and the Belmont Report. These emphasize the importance of protecting human beings in research to ensure that individuals provide informed consent, that their privacy is protected, and their data is managed securely and confidentially. Mainly, they exist to make sure that the atrocities that happened earlier in the 20th century do not occur again. So as we saw in the video clip earlier, values and principles help us to determine what is ethical. Around the world, 4 key principles are now used to consider whether research involving people is ethical. And these are research merit and integrity, justice, beneficence, and respect. But at its most basic, research that involves humans must respect the dignity, the rights, and the welfare of the people who are involved. In Australia, these values were written into the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research. It was first published in 1966, and it helps us here in Australia to navigate the complex landscape of human research ethics. In Malaysia, you have the Malaysian Code of Responsible Conduct in Research, which emphasises the importance of ethical oversight in research involving human participants. While the Malaysian Code itself does not explicitly mandate that all human research be approved by an ethics committee, it aligns with international best practices and supports the establishment and utilisation of ethics committees to ensure responsible conduct in research in Malaysia. And I understand that your university has its own ethics committee to make sure that this occurs. But as part of UOW Global Enterprises, any human research undertaken at UOW Australia or Malaysia must be approved by an appropriate human research ethics committee. So what we'll do now is we'll have a look at those 4 key principles and how they apply to your research. Okay, so starting with research merit and integrity, what this principle basically means is that research should be well designed, it should be conducted by qualified individuals, and it should contribute to knowledge or the social good. If there is no scientific merit to your research, the use of human participants is not ethically justifiable. So when you are designing your research, you want to be asking yourself, is this research justifiable by its potential benefit? What gap in knowledge is it filling? What is the proposed research contributing to knowledge and understanding? Does the research design use methods that are appropriate for achieving its aims? Is the study design based on a current literature review? Is the research being supervised or conducted by people with appropriate experience, qualifications, and competence? And is the research using appropriate facilities and resources? So the second principle is that of justice. And when we think about justice in research, the principles centre on ideas of fairness in terms of where the burden of participation lies and where the benefits of the study are likely to be felt. The benefits and burdens of research should be distributed fairly, making sure that no group is unfairly disadvantaged or exploited. So the key questions you're asking yourself here are, is the selection, exclusion, and inclusion of participants fair? Is the recruitment process fair? Which includes not pressuring people to take part in your research. If there is a power imbalance, for example, making sure that you have designed your project so that people who are in an unequal position don't feel coerced into taking part. Is there an unfair burden of participation on certain groups? Is there fair access to the benefits of research? And will the outcomes be made accessible to participants in a timely and clear manner?
老公，接下来我不会开麦了啦。如果你要弄东西无所谓的。如果我接下来不会开麦了。如果你要弄东西无所谓。
Did someone have a question? Okay. So the third principle we're going to talk about is beneficence, which is a fairly strange word. I don't really know where they came up with this one, but basically what it means is that the likely benefits of the study must justify any burdens or risks of harm to participants. Your research should be designed to minimise risks and maximise the potential benefits for participants and the greater society. Basically, when participants are placed at a greater risk of harm, the likely benefits of the study are put to a higher test. So the key questions to be asking yourself are the risks to participants proportionate to the likely benefits of your study? In the research design, are you appropriately minimising the risks of harm to participants? And the final principle is that of respect, which basically underpins all the other principles. Respect in research means that participants' autonomy, privacy, and dignity is protected. It means obtaining informed consent and respecting cultural values. So the key questions you need to ask yourself in terms of respect is the information communicated to your potential participants in lay terms? Will the participants understand what they're agreeing to take part in? Do participants have enough time to consider whether they'd like to participate? Is their consent given freely? And importantly, does the design of the research appropriately recognise that participants have different belief systems, they have different experiences and backgrounds? Or do the researchers assume that participants will feel a particular way about the study? So to recap, human research is research conducted with or about people, their data, or their tissues. I'll come back to about the risks at the end. If you like, we'll have a further conversation about them at that point. So just to recap, human research is research about people or with people, their data or their tissue. And as a university, any researcher, be that staff or student who undertakes human research, must have approval from a human research ethics committee. In practicality, any project that collects data or accesses existing data about people, analyses it, and then disseminates the findings requires ethics approval. I guess just basically touching on the risks and benefits. Risks are acceptable if they're proportionate to the benefits of the study. So when you think about a potentially life-saving drug that's being used in a clinical trial, the risks that are accepted are higher because of the potential benefits of that kind of research. So if your research only has, not many benefits for participants or the greater community, then there should not be any risks of harm, or the burdens of participation should be quite low for participants in order for it to be ethically acceptable. We can talk more about that at the end. Okay, so if we just touch on how the ethics process works and how ethics committees are constituted. So here at UOW Australia, and I understand that the ethics committees at universities in Malaysia are quite similar in that you have a chairperson, you have members from the community who have no paid affiliation with the university, you have a professional carer, a pastoral carer, a qualified lawyer, in addition to researchers who understand the subject matter that's being discussed. So basically what this means is that the committee is not made up of all academics or all researchers or all university staff. A good proportion of the committee will be people who are independent to the university, and what that does is provide a diverse range of perspectives on the ethical acceptability of the research that's being reviewed. And independence is really the most important part, I think, of any ethics committee. So I'm just going to have a quick talk about ethics dumping. So in my view, ethics dumping is like a 21st century version of the unethical experiments conducted in the 20th century that we spoke about, but with new dynamics. While past unethical research often occurred within a country's borders, ethics dumping typically involves outsourcing unethical research to countries or populations with weaker ethical safeguards. Ethics dumping refers to the practice of conducting research in countries or communities with less stringent ethical oversight to bypass stricter regulations in the researcher's home country or institution. This often leads to the exploitation of vulnerable populations, particularly in low and middle income countries. So the key parallels between the unethical research that we talked about in the 20th century and the ethics dumping that's happening today is the exploitation of vulnerable populations. So they both disproportionately affect marginalised communities who have limited power to refuse participation. They both involve a lack of informed consent. Many past studies, like the syphilis experiments, involved deception or failure to properly inform participants, which is similar to how some modern studies bypass rigorous consent processes. There is a failure to minimise harm. So just as those experiments in the 20th century exposed participants to unnecessary risk, be it radiation or biological pathogens, modern ethics dumping often lacks adequate risk mitigation measures. And what they both do is extract knowledge without benefit. So they, in the past, involved extracting biological samples, for example, without compensation. And that's quite similar to how contemporary researchers may use data that they're collecting from vulnerable communities without ensuring local benefit sharing. So I just would like you to have a look at a quick case summary on ethics dumping that happened in Liberia. So if we just have a quick read of this, and while you're reading it, I'd like you to keep in mind the principles that we discussed earlier of research merit and integrity, justice, beneficence, and respect. So I think Jasmine has shared the document with you, but I can put it up on my screen and hopefully you can read it there. And I'll just give you 5 minutes to read through it, and then we'll talk about what it means in terms of ethics today. Okay, hopefully everybody's had a chance to read through that. So I just want to ask you, perhaps you could come off mute or put in the chat some of your thoughts in relation to this. What do you think the primary ethical breaches were in this case? I should have mentioned that IRB is called an Institutional Review Board, which is an ethics committee in some countries. What do you think the ethical breaches are? Okay, so there was no ethics committee approval for starters. They took advantage of a vulnerable population in a time of distress, which is basically what we call exploitation. Yes, there was very little beneficence. Yeah. Yes, data collection occurred before obtaining ethics approval. Critical elements of the consent process were not present. Correct. Potentially harmful research was conducted without professional advice and approval. No formal consent was secured from participants before the data was gathered. Exactly that. Excellent. All those things. So, what harm might participants have experienced? They were asked very sensitive questions. Exactly. Very vulnerable population. Their experiences were being used for research without informing them, without getting their consent. There was no return to them from the benefits of the study. So without ethics approval, it's impossible to have the results of a study published in a journal. So I'm interested to know whether you think that the ethics committee should have provided retrospective approval for the research. Do you think it would be in the public good to share the results of this study with the world? Do you think there are any benefits to the participants for the research, in the research, that we should share with the world so that there are some benefits? I'm interested to know whether you think that the Institutional Review Board provided ethics approval retrospectively or not.
Uh,
Yeah.
Good morning. Good morning, Amy. I think
Good
that yes.
morning.
Good morning, Amy. I think that yes, if it's the retrospective study, if we can benefit the human being, for instance, they are doing more research. If the researcher can prove the particular research is to eradicate the Ebola virus or to have further advancement in the field of scientific, then I think that yes, they can be granted. But of course, they
Yeah.
have to have a prior ethical approval and all that. But if they want to study why the participant, for instance, who have got this disease, and maybe it's on the future advancement of the scientific field on the Ebola virus, or maybe if they would like to prove that any clinical study or further advancement on the drug advancement, like second medical uses, how to advance on this virus, then I think can be granted. But of
Yeah.
course, they have to prove that. Yeah, that's the thing. My opinion on that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for sharing that. And within that IRB, that ethics board, they were quite divided. They some of the members of the board agreed with exactly what you've said, that, well, let's just, give these participants who've already been through the distress of taking part in the research some benefit in sharing what they learned with the world and advancing medical science in that regard. But Jasmine, the other half, you're right, agreed with what you're saying, that yes, there was a benefit to the research. However, appropriate measures were not taken. And there was trauma involved here. The participant group was a vulnerable group. They were uneducated mostly. They had little knowledge of the consent process. And in the end, after much debate, the Liberian review board determined that they would uphold the autonomy of the ethics process and the autonomy of the research participants, and they did not approve the study retrospectively. So the results of the data could not be published in this situation. But you both made excellent points. And as I say, this is why ethics committees are made up of such a diverse range of people, so that everybody's views can be discussed and heard in making a decision as a group. Okay, so we've explored the history of research ethics and the key values that guide ethical research involving people and their information. Now I would like to focus on two of the major contemporary issues in research ethics, which are privacy and social media. So with the rise of digital data collection, researchers have to navigate issues of informed consent, data security, and the potential for re-identification of individuals, even in seemingly de-identified data sets. So these kind of ethical issues didn't exist before computers, before big data and big data sets, and the easy accessibility of such information that occurs now with online communication. Protecting participants' personal information is more challenging now than it ever has been in the past, particularly in large-scale studies that are using big data. To start with, I thought it would be good to think about personal data and privacy beyond the research context to help us understand why it is that we take privacy so seriously. You might remember a case from a few years ago in 2020 involving the unsolicited data collection of personal data by 7-Eleven. I believe you have 7-Eleven in Malaysia. We have them here in most suburbs. They're like a little corner store, service station, petrol station, used by a lot of people in their daily lives. So in that case, 7-Eleven had a tablet, like an iPad, at each checkout for customers to complete a voluntary survey about their experience in the store. And without telling customers, 7-Eleven were taking photos of their face through the tablet's built-in camera. In justifying this practice, 7-Eleven said that taking the images and using facial recognition technology to analyse them was needed so that they could make sure their staff weren't falsifying positive survey results about themselves. More recently, last year, here in Australia, our Information Commissioner undertook an investigation into the use of facial recognition technology by some retail stores here, a big department store called Kmart, a hardware store called Bunnings, which is in every suburb in Australia, and a white goods retailer called The Good Guys. When the investigation was first announced, there was a lot of noise from both sides of the case. Consumer data advocates said that the use of facial recognition technology in this way is pretty much the equivalent to having your fingerprints taken or your DNA removed from you every time you enter the shop. On the other side, the chief operating officer for the retail stores justified its use by saying that this technology is an important measure that helps us to maintain a safe and secure environment for our team and customers, and that they let customers know about the use of CCTV and facial recognition technology through signage at the store entrance and also in their privacy policy, which is available online. In both the 7-Eleven case and in this more recent investigation, the retailers argue that the use of facial recognition technology is explained in their privacy policies and on tiny signs at their store entrances, and that by entering the store, customers are consenting to the conditions of these policies. The outcome of that investigation was the same as the 7-Eleven case. Both were found to be in breach of privacy laws because, in short, putting something in a privacy policy doesn't count as obtaining informed consent to collect people's sensitive and personal information, which is how health information like facial biometrics is classified. So another relatively current and questionable privacy practice was found in the game sensation Pokemon Go. Probably you're all a lot younger than me, but I'm hoping you remember Pokemon Go. It was an app developed by Google where people would run around the world physically in real time and collect these little Pokemon monsters that were virtually positioned in particular geographic zones. The idea was to collect as many Pokemon as you could, with certain values placed on some more than others. It was a game, an online game. However, what I didn't know until recently was that when global companies like McDonald's and Starbucks recognized how insanely popular the game was, they paid to have Pokemon positioned near their stores, which would effectively herd groups of people to nearby areas in an aim to stimulate sales. In this way, data about us and our seemingly innocuous behaviour, such as where we'll go, what we'll see on our way there, were traded as intel for these companies, who then use the information to manipulate our actions in the name of profit. I'm glad some of you have played Pokemon Go, I think. And I feel like we can't really talk about privacy scandals without mentioning the influence that Cambridge Analytica had over the 2016 US election. Many of you would be aware of the way that Cambridge Analytica harvested personal data from 80 million Facebook user accounts without telling them. They profiled these people based on intimate details of who they are, what they like, where they get their news feeds. They packaged this data about them and sent it to the Trump campaign, who then used it to influence voters' thoughts and behaviour via targeted Facebook ads. So I'm not sure, hopefully you can see this cartoon over here on the screen. The caption says, "Suppose, gentlemen, we could deliver to your pharmaceutical companies an audience of more than 1 billion inexplicably depressed people." What it's referring to is an experiment that Facebook conducted on almost 700,000 of its users. In their research, over the course of a week, Facebook manipulated the feeds of these users by editing the kind of content they received from their online friends. In some cases, they limited the amount of positive content that users were exposed to see if they became happier or sadder, which was measured by the kinds of posts that they would then make. So while some had less positive content, others were given more positive content to see if they became happier. Essentially, Facebook were manipulating the emotions and psychological state of these users to see if the emotions were contagious. If the tone of your feed was more negative, would you yourself feel sadder? When the week of the experiment was over, it was found that these people, the subjects essentially of Facebook's experiment, were more likely to post either positive or negative words themselves in alignment with how Facebook had skewed their content. So there's a lot to unpack from what Facebook tried to do here. Firstly, they made people, Facebook users, research participants without telling them, and evidently without their consent. Not only did they observe these people, they actively manipulated their state of mind, and the results are evidence that they caused emotional harm to some users. Secondly, they conducted the study without receiving ethics review or approval. And thirdly, without telling you how you should feel about this particular situation, it's worth reflecting on the kinds of questions that a study of this nature poses. Say practices like this were able to play out unchecked in the way that Facebook attempted to conduct this study. What kind of precedent would it set? What is the role of ethics review and regulation when considering research like this? And fundamentally, why is it what they try to do is considered so wrong by so many people? If we bring it back to the cartoon, it's clear that for many, having Facebook manipulate and extract data on users' emotional states raises serious questions about how else this power might be exploited and who has the ability to monitor the integrity of these actions. So there's a question in the chat. How about image processing for analysing and improving staff efficiency by collecting data on employee movement and time? Okay, so we're going to touch on that. So I'll just put that one on pause while we continue our conversation, and then we can come back to thinking about that exact question. Okay. For those of you who will conduct research with human participants, you're probably thinking that because you're not looking to swing an election or manipulate participant emotions without telling them, that this isn't really relevant for you and the research you'll be doing. However, while those cases are really public and quite extreme examples, they help us to map out what this space of personal information and privacy looks like today. They provide a baseline understanding of why protecting personal data is important in research and beyond research. We draw from the examples on the previous because whether it's personal data harvested from Facebook or personal data that was provided during your participation in a study that you consented to, all personal data is highly valuable, no matter where it comes from. This is the broader context in which we need to view the privacy rights of research participants. And it's why we need to take such care when collecting, using, and disclosing personal information in research that's conducted at our universities. So when I was reading about the investigation into Kmart, Bunnings, and the Good Guys for using facial recognition technology, one article referenced the fact that in a recent survey of 1,000 Australians, 76% of respondents said they didn't know that retailers were using facial recognition technology. In the same survey, the words used to explain how respondents felt about this technology were creepy and invasive, and there was an overarching concern that the technology had the ability to cause harm. So what this says to me is that, number one, people generally don't know that this is happening. And number two, when they do, the feeling is a kind of vague disgust. And for me, this reflects how privacy more broadly is felt and understood as something that has the potential to cause harm without a clear understanding, perhaps, of what that might be. There seems to be a need to actually connect the concept of a privacy harm with the very real, very tangible effects that they can have on our lives, what these harms actually look like. The examples from the previous slide reflect structural privacy harms, the erosion of democratic freedoms, the transformation of individuals' personal data into collective data sets to be sold without individuals' consent for profit, and the application of facial recognition technologies whose algorithms include biases that more accurately identify white men than any other demographic, which can lead to higher rates of misidentification and incorrect prosecution of women and people of colour. Helpfully, here in Australia, one of our state governments, the Victorian State Government, has identified a range of more individually based privacy harms. And they have listed them as, for example, reputational damage, embarrassment or humiliation, emotional distress, identity theft or fraud, financial loss, and loss of employment or business opportunities. And when we think about the privacy harms and breaches that are most likely in a university research context, we're really thinking about these individual privacy risks, the harms posed to participants in the instance that their anonymity or confidentiality is breached. When we think about the risks of privacy breaches in research data, it's important to note that many of these breaches are not intentionally malicious. So a useful example to demonstrate this point and the kind of harms that can occur to participants, for example, say there's a team of researchers who employ an anonymous survey that looks at university students' emotional and psychological experiences. This team may get results that raise alarm, say if a participant indicates that they are experiencing suicidal ideation. In this situation, researchers can feel as though their duty of care is to assist the participant as much as they can. While the researchers shouldn't have access to any identifiable information, given that the survey was conducted under the condition of anonymity, if the survey was conducted in a particular student cohort, the researcher may feel as though it would be appropriate to try and identify this student in order to provide them with support. And while well-intended, to try to do so would be to attempt to breach the privacy of this person, who may only have chosen to answer so honestly given the anonymity of their participation. In this situation, all the researcher can do is ensure that the appropriate support for participants was embedded in the study prior to commencing data collection. For example, by providing the contact information of free support services like Lifeline, Beyond Blue, or the University Counselling Service. So now we're going to have a look at the key pieces of privacy legislation and the obligations that researchers hold under these laws. So for our purposes today, hang on, let me move on here. For our purposes today, the most critical principle from the privacy legislation is that the collection of any type of personal information must be reasonably necessary for the function of the agency collecting it. So let's think about that in terms of Dr. Thing Thing's question. If we think back to the way that 7-Eleven collected people's personal information, the biometric, the facial recognition, collecting that without telling them, we can take a lot from the way the privacy laws were applied to repudiate that behaviour. So in that instance, 7-Eleven said that they needed to take the photos to check that its staff weren't just filling the survey out over and over again to give themselves good reviews. While improving customer service is important for 7-Eleven as a business, this could have been achieved in other ways. The method in which it tried to do this was out of convenience, and the significant invasion of privacy was seen as disproportionate to its aims of improving customer service. So if we bring this back to the key principle from the privacy laws, the collection of this personal data was not considered to be reasonably necessary. So it's important to think about what this means in research. Say, for example, you want to recruit for your research and say that part of your research criteria exclusion is that people who have a terminal illness are not eligible to participate. Would it be reasonably necessary for you to have all potential participants fill out a screening questionnaire in which you ask them to declare whether they have a terminal illness and then have them submit their final questionnaire to you? Well, no. While the end goal is certainly to ensure that you don't recruit participants with a terminal illness, in this instance, you could simply state your exclusion criteria on any advertising materials and in the information sheet that you provide to participants. That way, you don't need to collect this invasive information from people who would never be eligible to join the study. And you still recruit the participant group you're aiming for. So a simple question to ask yourself might be, can I achieve the same results while preserving participant anonymity? If the answer is yes, then you should. So going back to Dr. Thing Thing's question, although you're not talking about research in your question, you're talking about business operations and collecting data on employee movements and time through images, your business or the employer would need to ask themselves, is there another way to achieve that same result without collecting images? So because that's not research, it wouldn't need ethics approval. So there is a team of researchers at the company doing research on this topic. Absolutely, they would need ethics approval to do that. And I assume in a study like that, there's always a risk-benefit analysis. The risks always have to be balanced by the potential benefit of the research. So an ethics committee would look and say, all right, well, is the potential benefit of doing this great enough that we can essentially deceive the employees by not telling them that their images are being collected for this purpose? So that's something that an individual ethics committee would have to assess. But yes, definitely would need ethics approval. Okay. Yes, so that's right. If you tell people that you're collecting data or images of their day-to-day activities at work, you may affect the way that they operate. You won't be getting a real true evaluation of how the staff are behaving because their behaviour has been affected by knowing that they're being recorded. So over here in research projects where the committee have decided that, yes, it would be beneficial to do research in this way. After the research has concluded, a debrief must take place in which the researchers sit all of the employees down or the research participants down and talk through what the research was and provide any support to them in case they are, emotionally distressed by having been subjected to a research project without really giving consent to do so. Okay. So the question again is, can you achieve the same results while preserving participant anonymity or by getting informed consent? Another increasingly common point being queried by ethics committees is the necessity of collecting data on participant ethnicity. Here in Australia, it's particularly relevant to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. They're widely recognised as among the most researched peoples in the world. In Australian research practice, it's become almost a default to ask participants in surveys, in demographic questionnaires, to indicate whether they identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. However, as research practice progresses, researchers are being asked to justify the necessity of this information. They need to show the link between what their research hopes to achieve and why this information is needed for that purpose. So it's a bit of a shifting space at the moment. For those who are engaging directly with human participants, it's something worth reflecting on when you are deciding on your own questionnaires. Okay. The bottom line for you as researchers is you need a good reason to collect a participant's personal information. And if you can achieve what you're looking for without collecting personal information, for example, by collecting information in a de-identified format, you should. By doing this, you minimize the risk profile of the information you are collecting. So as I've mentioned a couple of times already in ethics, we are always weighing up risk versus benefit. And if the risk of a particular research activity is lower, then it won't be put to such a high test of justification by the ethics committee. If information is de-identified or coded, the risk profile of this information is lowered. And this brings us to a key point about what de-identified actually means, and in particular to consider how the information you collect from participants might seem de-identified, but turn out to be identifiable in particular contexts. So it's what we call the spectrum of data identifiability. The way that privacy laws are written can make personal information or not personal information seem like a binary. It either is or it isn't. But figuring out whether something is reasonably identifiable can be more difficult than it seems at first thought. The fundamental point being that you cannot just consider the data you hold on its own. So to best demonstrate what we mean when we say that data identifiability exists on a spectrum, we'll have a look at the exercise tracking company Strava. I don't know how many of you use Strava. It's basically an app that you wear on your wrist, and it tracks all of your exercise and gives you a really good summary of how well you've gone on your run on that particular day or whatever exercise you've chosen to do. And it's hugely popular. I was at a running festival yesterday here in Wollongong. Basically, everybody who took part in the running festival was using Strava as an app to track their exercise and how well they had done in their time on their runs. So Strava used a heat map, which they published a few years ago in 2017, that showed every single activity that had ever been uploaded to the app. So you can see the heat map over here on the screen. In the map, Strava removed all the direct identifiers. You can't see people's names. You haven't been given any information about precisely who used each route. And when I read that there were around 3 trillion GPS points on the map, I thought, how could you possibly derive any specific information from this? But when we understand data in context and look beyond the immediately obvious, it's still very simple to draw confidential information from a resource like this. So in locations like Afghanistan and Syria, for example, the users of Strava are almost exclusively foreign military personnel on active service. And these personnel use the app in the same way that everybody else does, with tracked location services, so they can receive specific data in return about how well their exercise went on a given day. However, because of this, it means that from the heat map that Strava published, it was possible to very clearly identify US military bases overseas. These bases glow clearly against the map. And zooming in on larger bases clearly revealed their internal layout, which had been mapped out by the tracked jogging routes of soldiers. These bases, these military bases, aren't even visible on Google Maps or Apple Maps, but they were clearly seen on Strava's heat map. The US military had no idea that this was going to be published, and once it was, called for an immediate review of its security processes. Over here in Australia, our public transport department made a similar mistake when they publicly released what they called a de-identified data set that drew from the travel routes of 15 million Mickey users. Mickey is like a travel card that people who use public transport here tap on and tap off to pay for their trips, their public transport use. The data set was de-identified to the extent that card IDs, which is the name of the person using the card, was removed. But researchers at Melbourne University discovered they could re-identify their own data and the data of someone they'd travelled with and link all the trips using the same card. And researchers also found they could identify someone unknown to them. One of the Labor members of Parliament had his travel history uncovered by linking the data with a post he'd made on Twitter, which located him at a particular place at a particular time. So the critical takeaway, I think, for you as researchers is this. Neither of these data sets are identifying on their own. However, it's the ability to link data that puts groups at risk. Data identifiability must not be assessed in a vacuum. It seems useful at this point to acknowledge that meeting the privacy laws is the bare minimum of conducting research ethically. Because privacy legislation only covers personal information, the world of non-personal information is not covered in the same way, but it's in this space that the world of ethical guidelines like the National Statement and the Malaysian Code exist. These apply to all data, not just identifiable data. And it's important to remember that there are research situations where you're working with non-identifiable information, so not technically breaching any privacy laws, but you could still be collecting and using data unethically. So this leads us to our next contemporary issue in research ethics, the use of social media data. So in research, there's often confusion about whether you need ethics approval when you're using information that's already publicly available. The general understanding is that if the information is in the public domain and does not involve interacting with individuals or collecting private data, you usually do not need human research ethics approval. Examples of public information like this, where ethics approval may not be needed, are government statistics or data sets, like census data that the government released, like those published by Malaysia's Department of Statistics, or other health dashboards where aggregate data is released and made publicly available, registries of births, deaths and marriages that are accessible to the public, court decisions or legal judgments that are published on official websites, and news articles, media releases, or content from public archives. Importantly, these types of sources are already published and accessible to the public. They do not involve re-identifying or contacting individuals, and they don't pose risks to participants because the information is already in the public sphere. So I ask you this, please put your answer in the chat. Do you see data on social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Reddit? Do you see this data as public information? Put yes or no in the chat. All right. Very good. Looks like most people say no. Some saying not necessarily. This is good. So a common argument made for the use of social media data in research is centered on the public nature of the information and the perception that people understand they're putting their information out into the world and that there's a certain loss of control that comes with doing this. However, while many social media posts or comments are in the public domain, they're not necessarily viewed as such by those who authored them. So our national statement here, and we're all guided by the same basic principles and values, is that the guiding principle, although the data or information may be publicly available, this does not automatically mean that the individuals with whom this data or information is associated have necessarily granted permission for its use in research. Therefore, use of information will need to be considered in the context of the need for consent or the waiver of the requirement for consent by a reviewing body and the risks associated with the use of this information. So it's an interesting situation and one that has to be thought through on a case-by-case basis. What I mean by this is it really depends on the kind of information that researchers propose to extract. Is it still sensitive information, even if it's not identifiable? And it also depends on whether people who post this information would reasonably expect it being put to certain use. So if they were asked to consent, would there be a reason to think that they wouldn't say yes? For example, if we received a proposal to assess the comments made on Facebook by people who support the anti-vaccination movement in Australia or Malaysia, and one of the aims of the proposed study was premised on there being a lack of logic in these individuals, there would be grounds to believe that these individuals would not consent to their information being used if they were asked beforehand. So these scenarios raise interesting ethical questions about data ownership and control. Like, if information came from you, but it isn't traceable to you, is it really yours? How much control do we deserve to have over information that originated with us? And with the growing availability of data, ethical questions about using social media data for research are becoming pretty urgent. Should researchers collect social media data? If so, when and how should they use it? Legally, social media users give broad permission for their data to be used when they accept a platform's terms of service. However, many users don't actually read or fully understand these terms, and they may not see their data as public. They often don't realise that researchers are part of that public, even if they do see their data as public. Studies show that despite agreeing to terms of service, users generally prefer to give explicit consents for their data to be used in research. Their views on acceptable data use also vary depending on the research context and goals of the research. So irrespective of whether you're proposing to collect reasonably identifiable information or completely de-identified information from social media, the key principles of ethics must be applied, and respect for persons should always be front of mind. Approval by the Ethics Committee is required for almost all research that proposes to use or access social media data. The key questions that the Ethics Committee will ask, and you should ask yourselves as researchers, are: how public is the information? What site are you going to be accessing, and what are the terms of use for that site or platform? Is the information in a closed group, a public-facing comment on Facebook or a tweet? If it is a closed group, how large is the group? Will group administrators consent to its use in research? Will group members be told of the researcher's presence? Will they consent to the researcher's presence? Secondly, what is the nature of the space from which the data will be collected? This is an important consideration in determining the ethical acceptability of the data collection and relates primarily to respect for participants' privacy. Many online spaces are highly private or sensitive in nature and exist as a social support for a particular group of people. It's important to consider the invasiveness of the researcher's presence. Even when no identifiable information is to be collected, as the level of intrusiveness grows, so do the risks to privacy. Researchers should keep in mind that the likely benefit of the research, again, must justify the risks to participants. This means that as the risks to privacy rise, so too must the likely benefit of the research. You must be clear with yourselves and with the public about why social media data is necessary for your work and what benefits that work will provide for society, especially for the individuals who carry risks by being included in the data. Here at UOW, we have a whole lot of information, resources and guides on ethics. One of them is social media and ethics. We have a whole web page about it, which I think you might find useful, although your ethics processes might be slightly different to ours. The resources might still be helpful for you in designing your research and just thinking about the kinds of principles and values that you need to be applying in designing your research. It's all public facing. You don't need a UOW email address to get into it. Just go onto our webpage and you'll see it. I think these slides are going to be shared with you, and all the links to everything that I've spoken about are on the different slide pages here. Okay, so I'm going to move on to animal ethics now. So maybe is a good time to have a look at any human questions that I've missed in the chat. Using the forced response feature available in most online questionnaire platforms, I might need you just to explain to me what you mean by the forced response feature. Was that your question, Jasmine?
Amy, just to clarify, because this day, right, a lot of those Google Form, when we design the questionnaire, the item, they will actually need us to answer before we actually can move on to the next section or the next page.
Yeah, look, yeah, that's okay. That's fine. When you are outlining your study protocol to the ethics committee, you would explain that feature and provide a justification for it. So in some research projects, it would be appropriate to allow people to skip certain questions for one reason or another. In others, it's essential that all questions are answered in order to get the information that you require to achieve your research aims. So it would be about making that clear in your ethics application and justifying it, but also in the information that you provide to potential participants before they agree to take part in the research, you would be giving them examples of the kinds of questions they would be asked. If it is a particularly sensitive topic, you would be letting them know that it's a sensitive topic and the kinds of sensitive questions that would be asked. And you would be telling them before they agree to participate that they must answer each question. Otherwise, their responses won't be considered as part of the research. Again, it's about justifying your approach and informed consent of the participants before they agree to take part. What if responding to a survey becomes mandatory? I'm not really sure what research project you might be referring to there. Does Dr. Soon want to explain that question a bit more? No? Okay. Well, look, just generally speaking, participants must not be coerced in any way to take part in research. So, for example, if the University of Wollongong wanted to survey all of its staff to find out how much computer paper they were using in a given day, then they could not email staff and say, you must complete this survey for my research project. That would never be approved by an ethics committee, no matter how low risk. You could never mandate that people become participants in a research project. Yes. So UO has put in a really valid point here that the information posted on social media might not be validated. People put all kinds of things on social media. It doesn't mean because it's there in black and white that there's a truth to it. This is true. You would have to take that into account in analysing your results and your data that you collect. Okay, Dr. Soon, I just can't imagine a situation in which a research project would be approved that is not optional for participants. Any kind of survey. I understand that some businesses who do not require to follow an ethics approval process may require all of their staff, for example, or students to fill out a survey for one reason or another. In terms of research, especially research at institutions like our universities, that would never be approved by an ethics committee. Okay. So we've got another half an hour. We just spent a little bit of time on animal ethics, which is quite a contentious topic, much more so than human research, believe it or not, because essentially people can decide for themselves whether they want to take part in research, but animals as participants can't consent for themselves, and the benefits to these animal participants are not always present. So I've got a couple of short little videos that I'm going to share with you on animal ethics, which I hope you find interesting. Let me know if you can't hear the sound.
We use animal models in our research because we can experiment with new treatments in animals before these treatments are really ready for the clinic. And we're able to then really get answers that we hope will allow us to take the information back to the clinic and come up with new and even better treatments.
We can't say whether something new is safe or whether it works unless it's gone through a proper set of tests. These tests actually have to begin at the level of animals, so it's very important to do that.
We're actually reproducing the cause of the disease in the animal model, and that is a tremendous advantage.
Fruit fly models, worm models, mouse models, rat models, you can tweak the system with genetics that you can't do in other systems. The reason we study these living systems is because they have the appropriate structure so that there's cells that talk to each other. There's different cell types within a given region. When you have it in a dish, it's much more difficult. You can look at a single cell type, but not necessarily the complexity that happens in the brain.
With an animal model, we can look for visible changes, microscopic changes, biochemical changes within the mice that would be impossible to do in a living human being, for instance, and would also be very difficult to do, say, in a tissue culture dish.
Many people who don't understand animal research will say, well, why don't you use computer models? Why don't you use cells growing in a dish? The problem with computer models is they have to model something. You have to understand the process before you can actually use a computer to further understand it.
We've made a great deal of progress in developing animal models for Alzheimer's disease, such that we can now take a human gene from families who have what's called familial Alzheimer's disease, where this amyloid protein is deposited in the brain. We can take the gene out of people, put it into a mouse, and those mice will develop that same protein in the brain as if the mice were developing Alzheimer's disease. We can develop various therapeutics, drugs, to try to remove that protein from the brain, or perhaps we can block it being deposited in the brain. All kinds of combination therapies can be tested in animals relatively quickly, and then we translate that into humans.
Think about this in terms of if this was your child, and what would you really need to see in terms of evidence before you're ready to try this experimental treatment in your child?
If we can demonstrate that the human nervous system works like the animals, it helps us to define treatments. And there's lots of things that we can study in animals that we can't in humans that give us the information that we need. What we can learn from the rodent models, we could never learn in the human being.
Animal models are critically important for any research in this field to move forward. You can do modeling using other mechanisms and means, but in this instance, certainly the animal modeling has been critical to our progress, our discoveries, and now our ability to really change lives of people who are living with spinal cord injury today.
I think it's important to understand that when we test in laboratory animals, it's not just people who benefit from that. It is animals that benefit just as well. Our pet population gets many of the same diseases that people get. In the process, we're not only benefiting humans, but we're benefiting the animals themselves.
We really are working in a time of bench to bedside. I mean, everything we learn in the lab allows us to go back and forth between clinical trials in humans, the preclinical work in mice, at the bench, in test tubes, and they really inform each other, and they will allow what's called translation from bench to bedside.
Animal research is that critical piece that is going to allow us to go forward. There would be no new drugs and no new devices without that type of research.
Okay, just one more short clip, and then we'll finish off talking about animal ethics, and we'll finish off today's session.
Smallpox is one of the deadliest diseases in history. But fortunately, it's been eradicated for over 40 years. However, samples of the virus that causes smallpox still exist, leading to concern that rogue actors might try to weaponize it. This is especially worrying because older smallpox vaccines can have serious side effects, and modern antiviral drugs have never been tested against this disease. To protect against this potential threat, the U.S. government is funding research to improve smallpox treatments and vaccines. And since it's unethical to expose people to a highly lethal virus, labs are using humanity's closest biological relatives as research subjects. But is it right to harm these animals to protect humanity from a potential threat? Or should our closest relatives also be protected against lethal experiments? What would you do as a scientist faced with this very real scenario? In many ways, this dilemma isn't new. Animals have been used in research aimed at improving human welfare for centuries, typically at the cost of their lives. This practice reflects the widespread belief that human lives are more valuable than non-human lives. People have different views about the ethics of animal testing and how it's conducted. But whatever your opinion, this scenario raises an important philosophical question. How do we determine the value of a life, whether human or non-human? One tool philosophers have used to consider this question is moral status. Beings with moral status should have their needs and interests taken into consideration by those making decisions that impact them. Traditionally, moral status has been seen as binary. Either a being's interests matter for their own sake, or they don't. And historically, many philosophers believed that humans had moral status and other animals didn't. Some contemporary philosophers, like Shelley Kagan, have argued that moral status comes in degrees. But even in this model, he argues that people have the most moral status. However, determining what grants any degree of moral status can be difficult. Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant thought humans have moral status because of their rational nature and ability to will their actions. A binary conception of moral status then suggests that beings with these capacities are persons, bearing full moral status, while all other creatures are things without moral status. But thinkers like Christine Korsgaard have argued a Kantian view should include many non-human animals because of how they value their own good. Another line of argument suggested by utilitarianism's founding father Jeremy Bentham and elaborated by Peter Singer claims that a capacity for suffering makes an entity worthy of moral consideration. These inclusive ways of thinking about moral status dramatically widen the scope of our moral responsibility in ways some people might find unnerving. So where do our monkeys stand? Our closest genetic relatives have high social and intellectual capacities. They live cooperatively in complex social groups and recognize members of their community as individuals. They support and learn from one another. There's even evidence they respond to inequality. And of course, they're capable of suffering. Yet despite all this, it's still generally common opinion that a human's life is more valuable than a monkey's. And that while killing one human to save 5 others is typically wrong, killing one monkey to save 5 humans is regrettable, but morally acceptable, even morally required. At some point, however, this calculation starts to feel unstable. Should we kill 100 monkeys to save 5 people? How about 10,000? If moral status is binary and monkeys don't have it, then theoretically any number of monkeys could be sacrificed to save just one person. But if moral status comes in degrees and monkeys have any at all, then at some point the balance will tip. The situation you're in complicates things even further. Unlike the scenarios above, there's no guarantee your work will ever save human lives. This is true of any animal experiment. The process of scientific discovery only sometimes leads to improved medical care. But in your case, it's even trickier. While the government is worried smallpox might be weaponized, if they're wrong, the disease will remain eradicated and your research won't save anyone from smallpox. You could try to quantify this uncertainty to help make your decision, but how do you determine what an acceptable amount of risk is? And what if there's so much uncertainty that your calculations are essentially wild guesses? These kinds of moral mathematics get complicated fast, and some philosophers would argue they're not even the best way to make moral decisions. But whatever you decide, your choice should be well justified. Keep building your code of ethics with another test. Your spouse has been accused of murder. They insist they're innocent. Do you believe your spouse or the evidence? Puzzle through this classic ethical dilemma with this video.
Okay, so in Malaysia, it's the same here in Australia, that is regulated by legislation, and it's called the Animal Welfare Act 2015 in Malaysia. And there's also a national code, a code of practice on the care and use of animals for scientific purposes in Malaysia, which provide the guidelines and guiding principles for the use of animals in research in Malaysia. And they're based on the 3 R's, which is a kind of a universal guiding principle now, that any use of animals should be aimed to reduce the number of use, refine the use, and where possible, replace animals with a non-living being, if possible, in your research to achieve the same aims. So that basically takes us to the end of today. Are there any last questions? I remembered I saw one through there asking about whether breaches of ethics could form a legal case. Yes, it has happened in the past, particularly where a breach of privacy is involved, or the exploitation of people without their consent. Yes, has definitely ended up in court. And there's a very famous case, the case of Henrietta Lacks, whose cancer cells were found to be really useful in cell line research. They were very easy to reproduce and to split and to use in research. And really, that cell line forms the basis of a lot of medical knowledge we have today. But Henrietta Lacks was never asked whether her cells could be used in that way, and her family were never given any benefit from the fact that her cell line has become irreplaceable in our research, our science, medical field in this day and age. And we have a comment here, the oncomouse case. Oncomouse mouse patent was granted to Harvard University An inventor argued its bioengineered mouse, which can promote advancement in cancer research, patenting not allowed for living organisms, which raises questions on genetically modified animals. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular case. Yeah, patenting a living organism. I'm not really sure about that, but did you want to say anything further about that, Dr. Kamini?
Yeah. Yes, a very good afternoon, Dr. Aimee. Because I'm doing also on the patenting laws and all that. So when I came across this Oncomouse case previously, when I studied and all that, and also did an article on that, we realized that there's a problem. They have that twitch. That means the researchers are very smart. So when they granted, initially was refused because it became a ethical concern pertaining to animal patenting. So what the researcher from the Harvard University they did is that they argued that ours is a genetically modified mouse, so it does not fall under the exclusions of the patent law. Even in the US patent law, they say that it did not fall into the exclusion because we are not patenting living organism, but the raised concern from the ethical committees and the ethical people, they say that no, it's still a mouse. Even if they call it oncomouse because it's an oncology mouse, they did advancement for cancer research. So they even argued. They said that this particular mouse is doing advancement for cancer research for human being. So that's the dilemma here. I mean, it raises a very ethical concern in terms of benefiting the human, like as mentioned in your video, and risking one life of an oncomouse to benefit of maybe 100 to 200 humans population. So it becomes a very ethical, moral dilemma when it comes to oncomouse. Because I also read a lot about the oncomouse case, and I felt very, deep down my heart, sacrificing a mouse, and they genetically modified the mouse to get the patent. And they argue upon on the advancement of the cancer research. So, like the Jeremy Bentham theory, maximization of happiness. So are we benefiting the humans at the expense of a poor animal? Like you said, that can't defend themselves,
Yeah.
That kind of a thing, yeah.
It's just so
Aimee,
interesting.
Yeah. It's
It's
really a
really
very
complex.
something to it's a complex case actually, but they granted patent for Harvard University because they twisted. They made it like a genetically modified animals. So they say it's not a living being. So actually it's unfair because it still comes from a living being. Yeah,
It
it's
still has a
crazy.
heartbeat. It's crazy.
Exactly. Still have a heartbeat. That's the thing. I'm also like, that thing is still a ambiguity in the law itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is the thing with ethics. It's a constantly evolving space. So we have these principles that we take and we accept them, and it's about applying those principles to an ever-changing landscape.
Yeah.
And with AI as well now, that's another big one, which is a whole different presentation on applying those existing principles to this emerging artificial intelligence technology that is just moving so fast. We couldn't possibly keep up with our guidelines and laws, really, with how fast that technology is evolving, that we're left trying to use these ethical principles to still make ethical decisions. It's interesting, but it's not always easy. Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming today. I'll give Jasmine a copy of these slides. I might just update some of the links in there so that it's your web pages that you can link to. And that's the end for today. I understand it's a public holiday in Malaysia. Thank you so much for coming on your public holiday and listening to me. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.